Mixed martial arts was a new idea in 2000. It had already been around as a sport for a while, but the name was normally No Holds Barred, or something along those lines, or Vale Tudo, or hybrid freestyle, hybrid wrestling as they called it in Pancrase. But there were organisations all over the world. There was Rings, Pancrase, Shuto, World Vale Tudo, the event that Hicks and Gracie won in Japan alone, and then there were other events claiming to be Vale Tudo or No Holds Barred all over the world. And while the UFC was the industry leader in the US at the time already, it was under heavy scrutiny, and this left Pride FC with a chance to capitalise and become the biggest event in the sport. The UFC held their last tournament at UFC 17 in May of 1998. That was also the event at which Jeff Blatnick allegedly coined the term mixed martial arts and asked reporters and fighters to refer to the sport as mixed martial arts rather than no holds barred or ultimate fighting. Pride FC held its first event in 1997. The tournament was the heart of the early Ultimate Fighting Championship events. Obviously the first four Royce Gracie competed in. Then they started adding super fights, but maintaining a tournament throughout. But the original idea was to have 8 men enter the tournament, and the one that's left at the end is the winner and the ultimate fighter, or whatever they wanted to call him. When they started adding belts and super fights, it got a bit more complicated, which can also result in it being watered down in the eyes of audiences. Tournaments in the US have pretty much disappeared now. A lot of commissions have rules about not letting fighters fight more than, say, 25 minutes in one night. So if you have to really make the choice as a promoter, do you want to just do a multiple night tournament, or do you want to shorten the fights so that the event isn't, it often works out worse for the tournament. An example of this would be the Yama Pit fighting. They had a heavyweight tournament. They wanted 3 rounds of the tournament, so they had to have the first 2 rounds of the tournament were only 1-round fights. And obviously a 5-minute fight, the first takedown essentially decides it. But with the proliferation of events and titles and guys who could be considered the number one guy in the world but hadn't met any of the other big guys in the world, Pride FC was in a brilliant position to put together this tournament, the 2000 Openweight Grand Prix, and get in big names to fight each other. Now, if you look at the UFC tournaments, a theme with them is that there'll be like a couple of guys who know how to fight, and then just a whole heap of guys who say they know how to fight, and claim massive street fight records and things like that. And it really got worse towards the end. Mark Kerr's wins at UFC 14 and UFC 15, he fought basically nobodies. In his, I think it was UFC 15, he fought Ranger Scott, who was just a fat guy in booty shorts who claimed to do Wing Chun or something like that. And it was embarrassing. He got kneed in the head and knocked out in 14 seconds or something like that. It was an actual heavyweight athlete against a guy who was basically let in because he said he was a good fighter. When you look at the rundown of the Pride 2000 Grand Prix, it is one of the finest tournaments assembled to that point. Even the placeholder fighters are not particularly bad. You've got guys like Hans Nijman and Osamu Kawahara, who are pretty much there just to lose, but even the alternate fight is Vanderlei Silva versus Dirty Bob Schreiber, which is both those guys went on to be fairly successful names in mixed martial arts, well, Vanderlei especially. The Pride tournament was wonderful because it had a heap of champions. It had Enson Inoue, the Shuto champion. It had Igor Vovchanchyn, champion of numerous tournaments throughout Europe. It had Kazushi Sakuraba, UFC Japan champion. It had Gary Goodridge, UFC finalist. Mark Coleman, UFC champion. Mark Kerr, 2-time UFC champion. Royce Gracie, 3-time UFC champion. It was a true tournament of champions, unlike a lot of the UFC tournaments had been. Now, the original idea with this episode was that I was going to focus on Kazushi Sakuraba's career, but I got bogged down in the brilliance that is the 2000 Grand Prix, not just for the fighting, but for the storylines that emerged throughout it. And while Sakuraba is going to be a big part of our focus today, there's several key threads that run through this tournament. It's a 2-night event. The opening round took place on January 30th, 2000. Took place at the Tokyo Dome, had an attendance of over 40,000, which is brilliant. It was a real step up from Pride's previous venues. It was their first event in the Tokyo Dome, and they held 1 event in October of 1997, 3 events in 1998, 4 events in 1999, and then in 2000, which began with this 2-event Grand Prix, they ended up hosting 6, and it just proliferated from there. This was really Pride starting to come into its stride. A quick rundown of the entrance of the tournament and the opening round. The alternate fight was obviously Wanderlei Silva versus Bob Schreiber, as we mentioned. Then you had Kazuyuki Fujita, the Japanese wrestler, versus Hans Niemann. Mark Kerr versus Enson Inoue. Mark Kerr, 2-time UFC champion, Enson Inoue, Shuto champion, had just armbarred Randy Couture. Akira Shoji versus Ebenezer Fontes Braga. Mark Coleman versus Masaki Sataki. Gary Goodridge versus Osamu Kawahara. Igor Vovchanchin versus Alexander Otsuka. Kazushi Sakuraba versus Guy Mezger. And Royce Gracie versus Nobuhiko Takada. Now, Nobuhiko Takada is a very important figure in Pride because he was part of the reason that the show even got a second show. It was his challenge to Rickson Gracie, which headlined the first event. He was not a good fighter. He was a dreadful fighter. And he got armbarred in both of those fights very quickly and easily. But he was a very famous professional wrestler, and it was due to him that Pride was able to get off the ground. What is particularly interesting about those early Pride events is that a lot of the fights were fairly boring. You had things like Seven versus Chemo, Dan Seven versus Chemo Leopoldo, where they circled each other for the best part of 20 minutes. You had a lot of fights that went to the distance. Akira Shoji took Renzo Gracie to a draw on one of the early Pride cards, and there were a few fights like that, guys just getting to the draw. While Takada was marketed as the Japanese hope, the actual Japanese superstar came almost out of nowhere and received very few favours on the way. Kazushi Sakuraba, when he enters for the Pride Grand Prix, they introduce all the fighters, and Sakuraba gets easily the biggest reaction. He became their star, and if you watch his fights along with the other fights on the events of the early Pride cards, it's really clear why he became a superstar. He was really exciting in an era of very slow fights, or very hit-and-miss fights. But Sakuraba himself is one of the focuses of our episode. He began as a pro wrestler. Well, before that, he'd been a successful amateur wrestler. He trained as a pro wrestler with Billy Robinson, the great catch wrestler from the UK, a veteran of Wigan Snake Pit, and their champion, basically. One of the best wrestlers in the world, went around the world challenging people. Student of Billy Riley, got to train with lots of great guys like Joe Joyce, Carl Gotch, and so on. And Carl Gotch went to Japan to teach wrestlers as well. So there's this proud tradition of catch wrestling within the Japanese pro wrestling circuit. It isn't necessary to be an actual tough guy anymore in professional wrestling, but the guys that Billy Robinson taught, he actually taught them how to wrestle. And you can see the hallmarks of Robinson in Sakuraba's style, the constant focus on the double wrist lock, the love of the low single, just things that are very old school catch and not so much in line with the modern wrestling game as you'd see it in the Olympics or anything like that. But also quite far removed from the Brazilian jiu-jitsu / judo norms. So in 1996, Sakuraba has his first real fight. He'd been working in Kingdom, which did a lot of shoot-style professional wrestling. So there were these matches that they'd occasionally wear the gloves and things, but they'd run through all the holds of MMA. But it looked like they were trying to outthink each other. But there were never like the holding spots where guys are struggling against each other. It was sort of like flow rolling, basically. If it was a shoot, it was agreed that they just work through the positions. But he finally has this match against Rene Ruse, which is a mixed rules match. Starts a theme with Sakuraba's career because Rene Ruse is a 6'7", 230-pound Dutch kickboxer, and Sakuraba is 190 when soaking wet and 6 foot even. So Sakuraba gets the victory by toe hold in that fight, and then he has his first no-holds-barred match against Chemo Leopoldo. Now, you'll remember from the early UFCs that Royce Gracie won 3 of the first 4 UFC tournaments. The one that he didn't win was UFC 3 when he had to pull out due to injuries sustained in his victory over Chemo Leopoldo in the opening round. Chemo knew a bit of jiu-jitsu, he'd studied a bit, he also knew how to wrestle, he was also significantly bigger than Royce Gracie. So he pinned Royce Gracie in his guard and just battered him. And the thinking is that if Chemo didn't have a ponytail, which Royce Gracie could latch onto and maneuver him by, Royce probably wouldn't have got the win. It was only a 4-minute fight, but it really took the toll on Gracie, even though he got the armbar submission win. So Sakuraba fights Kimo Leopoldo in 1996, shoots in on him with a low single. Kimo sprawls on him and moves to take his back, but Sakuraba stays in the turtle. And while Kimo is reaching through on the far side to catch the wrist and trying to dig his near side arm in under the throat for a choke, he does something that I've never seen done since, and I think it's a very clever thing to do, actually. He begins headbutting Sakuraba in the back of the head, which head-on-head collisions generally not a great idea, unless you're getting something soft like the front of the face. You can cut the skin, but if you're using your forehead against the back of the head, you've got a good chance of stunning them. Additionally, both the hands are tied up. You are working with both your hands, and they are fighting off both your hands. So you are firstly hitting them somewhere that they can't see it coming, but secondly, they couldn't possibly think of it coming because both your hands are occupied. It's an impossible strike if headbutts aren't legal. And strikes to the back of the head aren't legal, of course. But he roughs Sakuraba up a bit, and he finally gets the arm triangle choke and gets the win. So Sakuraba's career starts in a unspectacular fashion. Sakuraba trains with a guy called Kanehara and another guy called Yoji Anjo for the UFC Japan tournament. Anjo and Kanehara want to enter in order to advertise Kingdom. These are all guys working in the Kingdom professional wrestling organization. But Kanehara gets injured, and while he and Anjo are both true heavyweights, they're both 200-pounders, Sakuraba is not, lies about his weight, exaggerates it by 20 pounds to get into the tournament, and immediately is matched against the biggest guy in the tournament, the 240-pound Marcus Silveira. And in the course of the fight, Sakuraba gets trapped against the fence, Silveira starts swinging, and Sakuraba drops low for his low single. Low single is not something you really saw in MMA, and you don't see it now either. It's a very weird look, and Sakuraba got a lot better at setting it up as he went through his career, but the way that he dropped to the mat, it looked like he'd been hurt, so John McCarthy steps in and stops the fight. Tank Abbott took the decision over Yoji Anjo elsewhere in the 4-man tournament. And again, these are 4-man tournaments now. We're not doing 8-man tournaments anymore, and it's just not really, it doesn't feel as real if you're not doing a full tournament, if you're just doing semi-finals and then final. You can see why people would have gone off it in favour of the one-on-one fights and super fights. But Abbott gets the decision and injures himself in the process, so they're looking for someone to step in against Silveira in the final. So they decide to repeal the original loss from Sakuraba, call it a no contest on video review, and Sakuraba gets another shot at Silveira. Silveira immediately takes Sakuraba down and begins working up Sakuraba into mount. Sakuraba grabs a hold of the Kimura, or the double wrist lock rather, and just keeps a hold of it. And Silveira is moving into mount, and still Sakuraba manages to immediately get up to his knees with the Kimura. And this is a constant theme in Sakuraba's fights. It's a constant theme in catch wrestlers generally. They don't like going to guard, they prefer to get up to their knees. They build up so that they could stand up, or so that, in Sakuraba's case, the other guy will keep a hold, and Sakuraba will start separating the wrists and looking for the double wrist lock. And each time Silveira slams him down on one side or changes sides, Sakuraba will just release the wrist, grab the other wrist, and start working for a double wrist lock on that. He's not so much a one-trick pony, but that one position works so well for him. You know, he looks for Kimuras and takeovers, the sumigaeshi as it's called in judo, and stand-ups off it. They scramble back to their feet, and Silveira ends up in his half guard attacking a Kimura on Sakuraba. And there's a nice moment in the half guard where he uses his knee shield to knee Sakuraba in the face, which is obviously something you don't see very much, but even when knees were legal in Pride, you didn't see that very much either. Happens all the time if you like playing knee shield and you're rolling with guys, but you very rarely see guys use it intentionally. But Sakuraba shows the other side of that clinging to the double wrist lock as he frees himself from half guard and runs around the top of Silveira to attack an armbar. And he's grimacing and straining and finally gets it and forces the submission. If you remember Matt Hughes versus George St. Pierre 1, it's the same thing. If you hold onto that Kimura and you don't have control of the position, you see guys like Ken Cornelius use the Kimura very well from the bottom of half guard to spin for arm bars or back takes. But if you aren't in control of it, the other guy can run around your head and beat you to it and get his own armbar. And this really sets up why Sakuraba, well, one of the reasons Sakuraba was so exciting. The submission could genuinely come out of nowhere. Typically at this time, you're seeing very positional-based jiu-jitsu. Guys are getting the takedown, they'll work their way to mount, they'll hit the guy, he'll either give them an arm as he rolls, or he'll roll over and they'll get the rear naked choke from the back. You know, you're not seeing very elaborate setups or anything like that. Whereas Sakuraba, through his career, because he uses this double wrist lock to turn people over and constantly dive underneath them and take them over the top of him, he ends up in these very strange positions and comes up on arm bars. A Sakuraba fight can really end at the times when he looks like he's in the worst trouble because he's given up his back. So Sakuraba gets picked up by Pride, and at Pride 2, he takes his first fight there against Vernon White, and it's more of the same, grabbing that Kimura, constantly rolling underneath his man, and he comes up on the armbar in the end. And it's the pattern that repeats itself for the next few fights until he meets Alan Goes. Alan Goes is a very successful Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, very slick guard. Sakuraba's grappling is unique in that he gives up this disadvantageous position in the jiu-jitsu hierarchy in order to attack from there. And it's very difficult to take down as well. A lot of the guys, most of the jiu-jitsu guys he fought couldn't take him down, except Silveira, because he was massive. But Sakuraba's guard passing game was very meat and potatoes. It was double unders or over-under or quick push the knees to the side and run round. He was not terribly skilled in like combining passes or switching sides or anything like that. The stuff that you need to beat like a world-class guard today. And his ground and pound wasn't tremendous either. So Alan Goes just kept shifting his hips, getting Sakuraba back in front of them, and then he'd kick him in the head from the ground, which obviously was legal in Pride, even if the guy was kneeling. So Sakuraba began standing up, and then it was a sort of stalemate where he couldn't really do much, because he didn't know what to do with standing guard passes, and Goes would just kick his knees, which were badly taped up, and if the head ever came close again, he'd kick at that too. So it goes to a draw. You could have argued that Goes deserved it, to be honest, because Sakuraba looked so ineffective once Goes started kicking from the bottom. But it created this need for Sakuraba to learn to do something from there. In his next fight against Vitor Belfort, who was, I believe, 6-1 at the time, still considered like one of the best guys in the world, really dangerous. And he blitzed on Sakuraba right from the start, broke his hand on Sakuraba's head, and then began to use the guard as Alan Goes did to protect himself and to fluster Sakuraba. But Sakuraba would stand with his right foot forward. Belfort would either look to put his left foot on the hip or entwine it with a De La Riva hook, and Sakuraba would just lift it up and punt with the lead leg, just a short digging kick into the hamstring. And that became his damaging weapon from that position. And then eventually Vitor stopped looking for hooks and stopped holding the ankle and things like that, and started like just curling up, and Sakuraba would take steps to the left or right. Belfort would have to move to face him with his hips, and as he moved, Sakuraba would kick him. The danger from that up-down position is always getting your standing leg hyperextended by one of those pushing kicks while you're going for a kick. And Sakuraba's knees were heavily taped up already in this point in his career. So he used to like to do things like peel one leg up and kick into the back of it with a very short kick where he wasn't going to get caught, or he'd start stepping around them and making them turn first. It was also in that fight that Sakuraba brought out the cartwheels and the running, jumping double stomps. I wrote a whole article about this on Vice called Sakuraba's War on the Guard. And really, that's just a way that he dealt with the problem of not being a very good guard passer. He couldn't get to the positions that he wanted unless guys obliged him in like coming after him like Carlos Newton did. If they sat back, he didn't really have the ability to get past their knees. So he'd just, one, use attrition by kicking at their legs, and two, appeal to the judges and the fans by doing the flamboyant stuff. The other constant feature of Sakuraba's game was the low single, which is really clever the ways that he used to set it up. He had very hard low kicks, so as soon as he could get the other guy picking his leg up, he'd shoot on the other leg. And he'd hang on to low singles. You know, in the Leopoldo fight is a great example. The later Vanderlei Silva fights would be a great example, but he would get an ankle and he'd just keep driving. And against the really big guys with a lot of experience, that ended up hurting him in the end. But if he could get an ankle, he could normally do quite good stuff with it. wasn't like a John Smith style low single with one hand on the mat and one hand, catching the ankle with the elbow pinned to the mat. It was more like a classical low single where you go both hands behind one leg and shoulder into the knee. Actually, John Smith used to put his head inside the knee, which can be quite dangerous. But Sakuraba was much more like Billy Robinson's, which you can see videos of Robinson teaching as an old man on YouTube. But Sakuraba was becoming Pride's star. He was the exciting guy, leaping double stomps over the guard, cartwheels, stuff like that really garners attention, and the bright orange shorts, and the showmanship that he had, and also his ability to finish fights. He was becoming their superstar, almost by accident. And they weren't protecting him in any way. They threw him to Vitor Belfort, who was had one loss after being the UFC champion. I believe that was Randy Couture he lost to. So for the first time in Sakuraba's career, he fights with a weight advantage this time against Royler Gracie. Royler Gracie only has a couple of no-holds-barred fights to his name, but the Gracies themselves, Renzo, Hickson, Royce, and Royler, they're the important ones, they are undefeated together in mixed martial arts / no-holds-barred competition to this point. And Royler finds very quickly that he can't take Sakuraba down, and Sakuraba looks to grab the double collar tie and knee his face off. So Royler flops to the butt scoot and begins chasing him, and he looks very confused, and the difference between Sakuraba in this fight and the Go's fight is so evident. He's become one of the specialists in this position in the world. It's not a very common position because the jiu-jitsu man will normally stand up and try and take you down instead, but they couldn't take Sakuraba down. They didn't like having his back because he was constantly working for the Kimura. So Gracie was in this position where he was saying, "Come to me," and he's trying to kick Sakuraba from the floor, and Sakuraba looks so much more experienced than against Go's. He's just pulling his leg back slightly, letting it miss, and immediately trying to punt Gracie in either the leg or the face afterwards. Gracie takes a horrendous beating on the floor, just to the legs mainly, but he also gets kicked in the face at a couple of points. In the second round, he tries to take Sakuraba down. Sakuraba flattens him out in half guard and begins working a double wrist lock, bringing the hand right up underneath the shoulder. Royler's grimacing. You don't really see guys finish from half guard very often. You don't really see guys finish the Kimura with the other guy's back flat to the mat, generally. But Royler begins grimacing, and the referee steps in to stop it, which becomes a huge point of contention with the Gracie family. It's the first time a Gracie's been submitted in the ring. But it wasn't really a submission, it was a technical submission. Because the referee stopped it without the tap. When really nowadays especially, we would just let the guy suffer the broken arm and then stop it. So Sakuraba is becoming the Gracie hunter. He has beaten a Gracie. He's the guy to beat a Gracie. He's the Japanese hope. He's beaten Vitor Belfort, which is probably the biggest name on his record because that's an incredible victory, especially for someone who was outweighed by 20 pounds or something against Belfort. He really is becoming Pride's superstar. So he enters this tournament, and in the first round he is matched with originally Kevin Randleman, but which would have been another UFC champion in the tournament. But instead, he meets Guy Mezger, a last-minute replacement. Now, Guy Mezger is a good kickboxer and a good wrestler, and he trained with the Lion's Den. He seemed quite ahead of his time in the way that his skills were quite rounded. If you saw, I would say the best performance I've seen of Guy Mezger, in my opinion, was his fight with Minoru Suzuki, where Mezger sprawls on Suzuki, repeatedly works him to the ropes, and then digs to the body. It's one of the very first applications of good body work in infighting that you'll see in MMA. And that was pancrase, so it was bare knuckle to the body too. And he just takes the will out of Suzuki, and Suzuki, a great wrestler, eventually tries to jump guard, and lands on the back of his head and suffers the TKO by jumping guard, basically. So Mezger's a very good fighter, and he really gives Sakuraba a hard time. Sakuraba struggles to get him down. Whenever he goes for the takedowns, Mezger begins working on the double wrist lock / Kimura, and he's looking to take Sakuraba over or attack the arm. And the two are awkward on the feet. Guy Mezger's trying some side kicks and stuff like that, but it's not really working. Sakuraba's trying the back kick that he made famous against Vitor Belfort and things, but Sakuraba's not a very good striker. He's just a guy who knows how to make someone think something's coming and then do something else different instead. His technique is sloppy as hell. So he's trying back fists and downward slaps and all sorts, and running inoki kicks and things like that. But by the end of the 15-minute round, each of these fights in the opening round of the tournament is booked for one 15-minute round, and then if it's a draw, there will be an extended round to decide a winner. An extension round, rather, not an extended round. So they get to the end, and no one's really done a lot of hurting. But Mezger has shut down Sakuraba's attempts to take him down, and not a lot has happened on the feet. So the judges rule that there will be another round to decide the winner. Guy Mezger is on the brink of the biggest win of his career, and moving on in a tournament that he wasn't reckoned to be one of the favourites in. But Ken Shamrock is in his corner, and Ken Shamrock jumps in the ring and starts arguing with the referees. Now, presumably, they signed a contract saying that this is what would happen in the event of a draw. Perhaps Shamrock felt like the draw itself was unjust, but he orders Guy Mezger not to get in the ring and to go to the back. So Guy Mezger, in what could have been the biggest name on his record, loses via TKO due to retirement. It's one of the really baffling decisions in MMA history, really, because what Sakuraba went on to do in the tournament, he couldn't have done if Mezger had been awarded the decision there or had gone on to win the extension round. A truly baffling move by Ken Shamrock, who succeeded in making his fighter's excellent performance about him, almost. So Sakuraba advances to the second round. Royce Gracie, the returning champion, is the other important part of the Gracie-Sakuraba rivalry that they're trying to set up. And in the main event of this first Grand Prix card, he meets Nobuhiko Takada, who is a useless fighter, essentially. Takada fought Rickson Gracie at Pride 1 and lost by armbar. He took a obviously fake fight against Kyle Sturgeon for Pride 3, wherein Kyle Sturgeon throws these shoot-style wrestling kicks that are designed to slap on the arm, and Takada dives to the floor twice with a look of, oh my god, he kicked me in the face, but I have resolved to continue, and then stands up and Sturgeon takes him down or something like that. And then there's a heel hook, and it just looks like garbage. And then at Pride 4, he fought Rickson Gracie again, got armbarred exactly the same way. And then at Pride 5, he fought Mark Coleman and heel hooked Mark Coleman, the UFC champion. And that was the big win of his career. Unfortunately, he paid Coleman to lose, or that is what has been confirmed by various parties involved in it. If you watch the fight, it's pretty clearly fake. Coleman passes Takada's guard effortlessly and then moves back into the guard and places Takada in position to finish the heel hook. It's one of the most embarrassing things you'll ever watch. But Mark Coleman had fallen on hard times, which we'll get to in a minute. Takada loses to Mark Kerr by Kimura in Pride 6, and then at the Grand Prix, he fights Royce Gracie. Now, Royce Gracie was the star of the early UFCs. UFC 1, 2, and 4, he won the tournaments, and he was the guy to watch at UFC 3, but pulled out due to injury. But the Chemo fight and the Dan Severn fight, which was later, they really drew attention to a detail that Royce's guard, while he knew more than the other guys, he could win, but his guard wasn't particularly effective for most of those fights. For most of those fights, he was on the bottom struggling. He had a super fight with Ken Shamrock, a rematch of their first match. Ken Shamrock lost the first match by jumping on a leg lock from guard, and Royce just following him up to mount, basically, and then getting rear naked choked. But in the rematch, Shamrock basically sat in Gracie's closed guard with bicep ties, controlling the inside line, and headbutted Gracie whenever he could. It was a really slow fight, but Gracie couldn't do anything because if you control the inside lines, it's very difficult for the guy. And Gracie insisted on wearing the gi. If you are the man wearing the gi and the opponent is not wearing the gi, you are at a massive disadvantage because he can hold the lapels, push them into your armpits, or hold them so that he controls the inside line on your biceps, and you're really going to struggle to get anything going. If both of you are wearing gis, he can grab the sleeve and start yanking it around and pulling it off, going for arm drags and things. But if only one man's wearing the gi, then all you've got is a load of handles on you and a smooth opponent that you can't grab anything on. And this really showed in this fight. Nobuhiko Takada sits in Royce Gracie's guard for 15 minutes, Doesn't achieve anything because headbutts aren't legal, but he just holds the collars, pushes them into the armpits or keeps them on the centre of the chest, and Royce can do nothing. But Royce wins the decision by basically just heel kicking the kidneys whenever he can. It's a really unimpressive return, and it's attributed partly to ring rust, but Gracie is through to the next round. One of the other key stories of the Pride Openweight Grand Prix is what I've titled the two Marks, but Mark Coleman and Mark Kerr. Mark Coleman was drawn into the UFC by allegedly by Don Frye's old manager when he and Don Frye fell out. Don Frye came into the UFC at UFC 8 and smashed through a particularly weak field to get to the final against Gary Goodridge, wins by submission due to punches, and then he enters the UFC 10 tournament. And Mark Coleman enters that too. The two meet in the final, and the 240-pound Mark Coleman ragdolls the 210-pound Don Frye easily. Don Frye pulls himself up by the fence at one point, but just gets slammed down again and eventually gets TKO'd around the 11-minute mark. Mark Coleman runs through the UFC 10 tournament, does the same in the 4-man UFC 11 tournament, and then at UFC 12, he unifies the UFC Superfight Championship with the UFC Heavyweight Championship by defeating Dan Severn, who he takes down and scarf holds, which is just essentially side control, then you turn your hips towards their head and you pull their head up. Normally you keep the elbow, but some of these big wrestlers, they don't even need to. They just sit out and crush you. Essentially what Dean Lister tapped to against Josh Barnett, but that was at the end of a 20-minute grueling contest of being ridden all the way through. Unfortunately, Coleman was a world-class wrestler, but he never really had the cardio, and that was drawn out by Maurice Smith, of all people. Maurice Smith, the kickboxing great, had a mixed run through Pancrase and rings, and ended up fighting Mark Coleman at UFC 14. His record was 5-7 at the time. He wasn't really impressing anyone, but his work with TK, Tsuyoshi Kosaka, and Frank Shamrock, he used his guard, got back to the feet, exhausted Coleman, and won a 20-minute decision. Once the news was out on Coleman, you saw he fought Pete Williams, and at the 12-minute mark, he was absolutely exhausted, reached for a kick he thought was coming to the body, provided one of the very first high kick KOs in MMA. And then he lost a split decision to Pedro Hizo over 15 minutes at UFC 18. And then he was done with the UFC. Down on his luck, running out of money, being thought of as a has-been, he signs with Pride for Pride 5 to lose to Nobuhiko Takada in what is one of the clearest fake fights you'll ever watch. But they give him a legitimate Pride contract, and at Pride 8 he decisions Ricardo Moraes, and then in January 2000 he's entered into this tournament. As a former UFC champion, he adds some prestige to it, and he's not done by any means, he's just sort of been worked out. Meanwhile, Mark Kerr is like the younger Mark Coleman. He's another gigantic 240, 250 pounder. He runs through the 1997 World Vale Tudo Championship, taking on Paul Varelans, the 300-pounder wrestler, mainly famous for getting beaten up by a lot of these top names in horrible fashion. Beats up Mr. Hulk, and then he fights Fabio Gurgel, the great Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt who trained Marcelo Garcia, founder of Alliance, I believe, and he batters Gurgel over the course of a 30-minute fight. Kerr runs through UFC 14, another 4-man tournament. Dan Bobish got to the final of that, which should tell you the level of these tournaments at this point. UFC 15, he fights Ranger Stott in the first round, which is just embarrassing. And then Dwayne Kaysen, he submits him in 50 seconds in the final of that tournament. So he's now a 2-time UFC heavyweight tournament champion. Moves to Pride at Pride 2, fights Branko Cikatic, who won the very first K1 Grand Prix, kickboxer, massive right hand, knocked out Ernesto Hoost twice. And Branko just fouls like crazy. As soon as Kerr starts taking him down, he wraps his arms over the ropes. The referee tries to stop him. He begins downward elbowing Kerr in the back of the head, gets disqualified in 2 minutes, and does the whole, like, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know thing. And Kerr's fine with it, but it was just, there's no sport where elbowing downward to the back of the head is legal. Kerr has a few more fights in Pride, and he really begins to live up to this smashing machine moniker. He fights a Vale Tudo fighter called Hugo Duarte at Pride 4, and Duarte is crawling out of the ring to get away from Kerr. It's gone down as a TKO retirement, but it should have been a disqualification. Kerr submits Nobuhiko Takada at Pride 4, and then he runs into Igor Vovchanchin at Pride 7. Now, the theme throughout Kerr's career, if you watch The Smashing Machine, it's an amazing documentary that covers his drug abuse, painkiller addiction, and his ups and downs in his personal life. He trained with Bas Rutten a lot to work on his striking, and there's a great interview with Bas Rutten where he just says they're taking away all Kerr's weapons. If you watch Kerr's first 3 fights at the International Vale Tudo World Vale Tudo Championships, you'll notice that there are about 18 different Vale Tudo World Championships in this episode. That's the proliferation of events and no one really checking the names. But if you watch his first 3 fights, Kerr is a monster. He'll just headbutt dudes, he's kneeing them, he's elbowing them in the face, he's digging his fingers into cuts and just mauling guys, which is what you expect from a massive wrestler. But obviously with no elbows to the head, no headbutts, a lot of Kerr's work from the closed guard is taken away. Igor Vovchanchin in the second round sprawls on a takedown and knees Kerr in the head, and Kerr goes belly down. And it's ruled a TKO, but it's changed to a no contest. Because Pride's rules are still in flux at this time. Throughout the opening round of this tournament, it's legal to knee and kick an opponent in the head if they are belly up on the floor, but it is illegal to strike them in the head with knees and kicks if they are belly down or in the turtle, which makes Sakuraba's position even better, really. But anytime there's restrictions on knees and kicks to the head on the floor, it gets very complicated. Cage Rage had a rule whereby the ref had to say open guard. I believe ONE FC had it for a while. And Andrei Arlovsky kicked Tim Sylvia in the head on the floor before it had been called okay to do so by the referee, and that cost him the fight. The more sort of restrictions you put on it, the more complicated it gets. We're finding this now with the new knee to the head on the ground rule, new knee to the head definition of a grounded fighter rules in the UFC, or unified rules rather. So this is super controversial because Vovchanchin and Kerr are considered the number 1 and number 2 guy in the world at the time. And that fight was sort of determining who's the best. And it comes to a very controversial conclusion. So Kerr's got a lot to prove in this Grand Prix, and he's in... and it's assumed that he and Vovchanchin will meet later in the Grand Prix. So in the opening round, Coleman gets Masaki Satake, the kickboxer, not a great kickboxer to be honest, and an even worse MMA fighter. Coleman can open as him within a few seconds. Very embarrassing to lose to a can opener, obviously. And then Kerr is matched with Enson Inoue. Enson Inoue is the Shuto heavyweight champion, I believe. Sorry, Shuto light heavyweight champion. And he's had contests with guys like Frank Shamrock, Igor Zinoviev, Rene Ruse from the Sakuraba fight. Very gifted grappler, and when Randy Couture begins to travel the world to show that he's the best in the world, not just the UFC, Inoue gives him his first loss by armbar from the guard, and it's a really basic thing. It's just that Couture made a mistake, and Inoue catches him, and that was in 1998. Inoue only fought once since then, picking up an easy rear naked choke in Pride 5, and then he fights Kerr, and he just gets stuck on the bottom, and a fairly boring decision victory for Kerr. The final character that I really want to focus on in this Grand Prix is Igor Vovchanchin. And Igor Vovchanchin is considered by many at the time to be the number 1 guy in the world. He was a kickboxer from Ukraine, a really short, stocky dude, didn't even really kick much, but he had these sledgehammer hands, and he'd throw his hands all kinds of ways. The way... Typically, if you watch back to like the 70s and 80s footage of boxing in the Olympics, the US teams were using lateral movement and straight hitting more. The Russian teams were using round punches to try and circumvent the guard. The phrase Russian hooks is always controversial, but you'll notice that in countries in the Eastern Bloc and that sort of area, the thumb down hook is a lot more common. There's all sorts of stories about casting punches and things like that. I think it's just something that became popular with the coaches there, and other methods have become popular elsewhere. There's no real national style anymore in a world where everyone trains with everyone. But those thumb down hooks and those very wide, long hooks were a lot more common in the Russian Olympic boxing teams than the American ones. So we can probably assume that they were, that when there were national styles, it was a bit more common that the Russians were doing the thumb down hook stuff. But yeah, Vovchanchin throws these hooks like a madman, almost clotheslines dudes. Because he is so short, he really has to make use of his reach. He starts out as quite a trim guy with a barrel chest, but becomes a very round guy. He likes to eat. He owns a restaurant now, so he clearly just loves food. But he has a fairly uninspiring beginning in mixed martial arts. He goes 5-2. His second loss is by chin to eye. Mark Kerr wins his second UFC title by chin to eye, or no, his first one by chin to eye. Chin to eye is a legit submission in the guard, if you're allowed to, because it's an eye gouge with your chin. But Igor quickly rebounds, and while he's not an amazing grappler, not amazing at getting off his back, doesn't really even have an amazing sprawl, he does work out some tricks that make him a little bit more difficult to take down. He measures his distance a lot better. He's very cautious and waits a lot so that he is basically just sprawling, and then later in the round he'll start swinging. But after that 5-2 start, he really goes on a tear. He wins the Mr. Strongman tournament, fighting 3 times in one night in January 1996. He wins the DNRF Ukrainian Octagon tournament, fighting 3 times on the 1st of March 1996. On the 9th of March, he fights 3 more times in one night for the UCMAL title. Then he fights 3 times in one night on March 30th, 1996, to win the IFC 1 title, which is the one where he beats the shit out of Paul Varelans and a couple of other guys who outweigh him by like 100 pounds. He wins the WVC World Vale Tudo Cup 5 tournament in February 1998, and then he signed to Pride. So maybe one of the best tournament fighters in no holds barred, or certainly of that era. He just ran through numerous one-night tournaments, all within a month, basically. There's 3 of those in March. Just astonishing what he accomplished in that regard. Not always amazing opposition, but there are a lot of these guys are turning up for one UFC every half year and fighting 2 guys with no hope. It doesn't matter how many it doesn't matter if they don't have a hope. If you're fighting often enough, you should lose. And he's going through these guys like a hot knife through butter. And the power that he generates is tremendous. He knocks out a lot of guys going backwards. One of the very first articles I wrote was a trilogy on Igor Vovchanchin about going backwards, backstepping punches, how you're creating structure, and how to torque your hips while moving backwards. He's a real study in that. So Pride really is where Vovchanchin's going to have his chance to show how he stacks up against guys who aren't just like locals from Ukraine or other areas in the Eastern Bloc. He makes his debut at Pride 4 against Gary Goodridge and TKOs him, then heads to Brazil and wins a couple of Vale Tudo fights there, returns to fight Akira Shoji, goes to decision, and then a few more tournaments around Ukraine, picks up that controversial victory over Kerr in 1999, September. In November, he starches Francisco Bueno. Bueno, not a notable fighter, but it is one of the most iconic knockouts in Pride history. He cracks him with the right hand, and Bueno goes stiff as a board and starts falling forward, and Igor hits him 3 more times on the way down. And then in the opening round of the Grand Prix, he meets Alexander Otsuka. Alexander Otsuka is not a good fighter. He is 1-3 at this point, having lost to Egan Inoue, Chris Haseman, and Renzo Gracie. With a TKO victory over Marco Huas at Pride 4, which is a surprising one. But this is as close to a gimme as Igor's going to get at this point. It's a 1-3 fighter versus a guy with 40 victories and 2 losses. And Otsuka is not like a proper heavyweight either. He's quite a light guy. And weirdly enough, Igor goes to decision with him. He just sort of sits on top of him in the turtle, like throwing in slappy punches. Throws in a couple of right hands on the feet, but doesn't really do much damage, just bloodies Otsuka's nose. Otsuka tries to a pro wrestling drop kick to the knee. This is what Otsuka is basically famous for. He wears shorts that say Diet Butcher on the back because that was his sponsor, which ultimately became more famous than him. But also he'll rebound off the ropes and try pro wrestling stuff against opponents who then just beat him up for it. So a pretty easy win for Igor Vovchanchyn in the opening round. But the remainder of the opening round, if we run it down, one of the standouts was... Wanderlei Silva beats Bob Schreiber by choke, the only choke victory on Wanderlei Silva's record. Dirty Bob Schreiber, not a very nice fighter. I believe he trained Stefan Struve, but previous to that he'd been DQ'd in Pride for axe-kicking Daijiro Matsui in the back of the head from Turtle in the corner after the bell to end the fight. Not a nice guy at all, if his behaviour in the ring is to be any indication. Akira Shoji and Ebenezer Fontes Braga went to decision, which Shoji won. Akira Shoji is a really interesting figure. He's not a very great fighter, but he seems to be able to take great fighters to uneventful decisions. I would call him a spoiler in that regard. You know, he went the distance with Renzo Gracie, he went the distance with Igor Vovchanchyn. He's just a pain to get out of there. But he never seems to take too much damage either. He became known as Mr. Pride because he fought on basically all their events, but not a particularly enjoyable fighter to watch. Gary Goodridge smashed Osamu Kawahara. Goodridge hit him a couple of times, took him down. From side control, put his forearm over Osamu Kawahara's throat. One of those forearm chokes which really shouldn't ever work, but gets the tap-out win. And then Kazuyuki Fujita beats Hans Niegemann by scarf hold, another one of those ones, or chest compression, whatever you want to call it. But Fujita, this is his first MMA fight, and he is a 3-time national champion, I believe, in Japan. Certainly won some titles in wrestling in Japan, and was a pro wrestler after that. Again, this is where you're starting to see that this is becoming the logical progression for the wrestler. If you have been a great wrestler, go to MMA. Whereas before it would be, if you were a great wrestler, there's nothing you can really do. Maybe go to pro wrestling, which isn't really wrestling, you know. But Fujita becomes a surprising standout of this tournament. After easily scarf-holding Niegemann in the next round, he gets a bit more interesting. One of the key events of the opening round of the tournament is that Ken Shamrock announces that he's coming out of retirement. He gets in the ring and says, "I'm coming out of retirement." He's been working with the WWF for many years, or a few years rather, at this point. He'd been advertised as the world's most dangerous man. He'd taken a few chair shots straight to the head because he was a hard man back in the day. And now he was deciding he wanted to come back to the ring. So they staged this cringeworthy confrontation at I think it was a King of the Cage event or something like that. Yellow cage, far too small, that's all you need to know. But Shamrock went to shake Otsuka's hand, because they brought Otsuka in for an American event for some reason, no one knows why. Otsuka refused to shake it. Shamrock said some pro wrestling style stuff, and Otsuka took the mic and spoke in broken English, trying to do the same. It was really cringeworthy, but it was the idea. They wanted to sell Pride in America, and that's what they did. The next event, on May 1st, 2000, again from the Tokyo Dome, the final rounds of the Pride Openweight Grand Prix. It was the first event available in America to watch live, and it was sold largely around Ken Shamrock. If you look at the poster, it says, which man will prove the Ultimate Warrior, or whatever it is. And Shamrock is on the poster as if he's in the tournament, even though he isn't. At any rate, the real matchup that people had their eyes on in the second part of the tournament was the Gracie Sakuraba matchup. And that was held first, despite being like the big event, because of the very special rules that they instituted for that fight. Now, you'll recall that Royler Gracie was, quote-unquote, technically submitted by Kazushi Sakuraba. And that was the first Gracie loss by submission in mixed martial arts. And that became a huge deal. That was going to be like the main selling point of the Gracies versus Sakuraba. Royce Gracie himself had something to prove after a very embarrassing return to competition jiu-jitsu, where he went against Walid Ismail. Walid Ismail, really interesting character. He didn't do very well in MMA, but he was an amazing guard passer, and apparently his very first tournament, he didn't know how to take people down. So he went around spreading the rumor that there was this amazing judoka called Valid Ishmael there, like Tobias Funke in Arrested Development. But he went around spreading the word about this amazing judoka, and everyone he was matched against pulled guard on him, so he just passed their guard. But he got much better, obviously, and he choked Royce unconscious with a clock choke in what was, a hugely anticipated jiu-jitsu match. Very embarrassing for Royce. And of course, all the rumours started that Royce crapped his gi pants when he was choked unconscious, and things like that. Another key event in between the opening round of the tournament and the finals, in February, I believe, Kiyoshi Tamura, who was another pro wrestler from the, I believe, UWF camp, and he trained with Billy Robinson as well, and he fought Renzo Gracie and took Gracie to a losing decision, which was Renzo Gracie's first loss in the MMA arena too. So within a few months of each other, the Gracies had suffered their first MMA losses, Royler and Renzo, against two catch wrestlers trained by Billy Robinson. It's very strange that Billy Robinson didn't become part of the narrative, and that catch wrestling didn't really become part of the narrative. It became a Japan versus Gracie thing, but very interesting nonetheless. Tamura did a fantastic job of stuffing Renzo's shots, working from the front headlock, and he finished the fight belly down on a crucifix and hitting Renzo in the head. So it was a very convincing victory. It wasn't like he edged it on the judges' scorecards. So for the Gracies, there was familial pride on the line. Royce wanted to come back and prove that he was the man. If you know much about the Gracies and the ones that fought, Royce, as a grappler, wasn't particularly special, and as a fighter wasn't particularly special either, out of the Gracies. He was more just a good poster boy for the Gracie family at the UFC events because he was one of the smaller ones. Renzo was probably the best fighter out of the lot, and Hickson was seen as the family's champion, even though he never, he didn't really fight the level of competition that Renzo did, but then Renzo lost a lot of fights because of that. Later on, of course, at this point, there's still only the 2 losses on their collective record. But Royce Gracie insisted that the submission loss of Royler was unfair, that he should have been allowed to tap or not tap or whatever. And they stipulated special rules for this fight. They wanted unlimited time. So the way that worked was that they were going to do 15-minute rounds, an unlimited number of 15-minute rounds, and there were various other concessions to having no rules. Throughout the fight, this comes up as a question because when the rules don't suit the Gracies, they will complain, or when the lack of rules doesn't suit the Gracies, they will complain. But then they were the ones who asked for no rules in the first place. It was very strange. But they had to get this out of the way first because obviously with the unlimited time, you want to be knowing when the next person's due on, especially in a tournament with all these fights that have to go through on one night. Royce Gracie came to the ring in his customary plain white gi. Even in the grappling match against Valid Ishmael, he sported the plain white gi, while Ishmael sported all the sponsors. In his corner were Helio Gracie, or Elio Gracie, and Rorion Gracie. Rorion, obviously responsible for partly the founding of the UFC, later sued his own family over the term Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. His sons are Henna and Hyan and Halleck. Elio Gracie, obviously the patriarch of the family, famous for inventing leverage. But the storyline of Japan versus Gracie and the Kimura lock goes far deeper than just this fight. Or rather just the Royler fight. The Kimura lock is nicknamed after Masahiko Kimura, a great Japanese judoka, famous for his osotogari, the large outer reap. Masoyama, the great karateka, famously called him the only man in the world who trains harder than me. All sorts of stories about Kimura. He bunny hopped a mile every day or something like that. He could give people concussions routinely with his throws. And he was famous for the gyaku udegarami, they call it, reverse arm entanglement, and that is what we call the Kimura today, or the double wrist lock in catch wrestling. But the udegarami really refers more to it as a finishing hold. The Kimura really refers to it as a finishing hold, whereas nowadays it's more a positional hold, like the double wrist lock is just a grip really, like the 2-on-1 or anything else. But the Kimura finish is what he was famous for. He took this fight against Elio Gracie, a grappling match. Gracie had submitted his friend Kato, I believe it was. And if you're familiar with the history of the Gracies and their matches, there's always this weird logic whereby they have you always see these comments on YouTube being like, "Oh my god, do you remember when jiu-jitsu used to mean something? Now it's just berimbolos and unrealistic bullshit." And you're like, well, Elio Gracie was famous for just holding closed guard and looking for cross collar chokes for 90 minutes, you know. But in the fight against Kimura tried to throw him hard enough to give him a concussion or knock him out, but he found that the mats were too soft to do that. So eventually he gets the udegarami, or the double wrist lock or whatever, and cranks it, and Elio doesn't tap, and it breaks his arm in 2 places. In the retelling, Kimura has grown every time it's retold, and Elio has shrunk. But the point was, it was one of those moral victories because Gracie didn't tap. At any rate, Sakuraba comes to the ring for this fight in a orange luchador mask, the one that would become his trademark, along with 2 other men in the same mask, and they're all wearing Sakuraba t-shirts in different colours. So the crowd got to wonder which one was the real Sakuraba. And it was just that showmanship that Sakuraba was famous for. Perhaps it was off-putting for Hoist. I don't know if it was, but eventually they throw off the masks and reveal that Saku is there, and they can finally get the fight underway. Now, with 15-minute rounds and unlimited time, the fight was always set to be in strange spurts, because you have to get a finish, but equally you don't know how long the fight's going. In the opening round, Hoist does take Sakuraba's back with the back body lock, and Sakuraba does something that is a piece of genius that, when he could get away with it, really worked incredibly well. Instead of just searching for his usual double wrist lock, he dived his head underneath the top rope, so that Hoist could not put his chest flat against Sakuraba's back. He would have to reach over the rope if he wanted to go for the neck. And he was also having difficulty reaching Sakuraba with good punches. And if Sakuraba stood up into that rope, it could also hold him still if Gracie tried to drag him out. It was real intelligent ring generalship. And you'll see, even in the grappling match between Sakuraba, I think Takuro was his partner, and Vanderlei Silva and someone else was Vandy's tag partner. They had a grappling match, and Sakuraba does the exact same thing in that grappling match. Head under the top rope and start working on the arm. And he does free the arm, and he starts working on a straight arm lock on it through the ropes, and the Gracie family is screaming that he shouldn't be allowed to put his head underneath the ropes, even though there are no rules in this fight, allegedly. And Gracie starts swinging punches in and landing some good ones on Sakuraba's head, but Sakuraba eats punches for breakfast. Eventually, they work their way free. And the other thing that Sakuraba does when guys have his back is that if they try and drag him to the mat with that classic old-school Gracie Jiu-Jitsu trip where you fall down to one side and you block the ankle on that side as you fall rather than like picking the opponent up, is that he'll try and step over or slide his butt over their leg and start looking for a knee bar, which is how he caught Carlos Newton trying to take his back. And he actually attacks the knee bar at the end of the first round. Hoist does get his knee free, but it looked dangerously close in the last seconds of the fight of the round. The fight finds a slower rhythm for the next couple of rounds, as Sakuraba and Gracie tie up in clinches mainly. The fight, if you haven't seen it, I would recommend watching it in one sitting. It's good fun because anytime something happens, it feels so much more significant because of the time limit. Hoist will hold him in the corner just trying to tire him out, and Sakuraba will be untucking his gi and pulling it over his head, and then Gracie starts getting in. The crowd go wild at this small sign of action, and Gracie starts flailing around trying to stop the gi going over his head, even though it probably wouldn't have been that big a deal, but he just doesn't want to give an inch, and Sakuraba just keeps playing with him and doing stupid things. Silly things, rather. In the few instances that they hit the mat, Gracie's guard is not a problem at all. Sakuraba can hold the gi if he wants to, but mainly just postures up and he'll do things like throw double downward chops onto the collarbones, the Mongolian chops to the side of the head, and at one point he reaches underneath Gracie for an old school judo pass where you grab the belt and you stack him up for the double unders, lifts him onto the back of his head and throws punches down on him. The ref does stop Sakuraba from putting his head out under the top rope for the rest of the fight, and the Gracies are all over the ring, all around the ring, running around, shouting at the referee and Sakuraba. The commentary team for this fight is Stephen Quadros, Mo Smith, and Bas Rutten, and they're hilarious, just going back and forth on is that in the rules, check the pamphlet, and just giving old stories. It's kind of like watching a podcast with the fight going on in the background. Really enjoyable. But as they get into the 4th and 5th round, past the 1 hour point of the fight, Hoist has started trying to throw some punches, and Sakuraba, each time Hoist runs in with punches and then looks for the clinch, Sakuraba uses the gi, the lapels of the gi to stiff arm Gracie away from him, and then he'll punt the leg on the way out. And Gracie's leg starts to buckle very early in the 4th, and through the 5th he eats the odd low kick, and by the final round he's just taking them fairly routinely, isn't able to check them, isn't able to do anything, switches stances, but Sakuraba just keeps in on him. The gi really does hinder Hoist in this fight, and it is none of the other Gracies fought with gis. Hickson didn't fight with a gi. It is something of Hoist's arrogance that he insists on wearing the gi at this point, when it's been proven in the Takada fight and the Shamrock fight that these guys who don't understand his guard as much as Gracie does have been able to stall him out just by holding onto his gi. At one point in the 4th round, I believe, Sakuraba comes out of the corner holding Gracie's gi and punching him like it's a hockey fight. By the midpoint of the 6th round, Gracie's limping and he begins looking at his corner. And Sakuraba's there with his mouth open. They are both exhausted. It's a 90-minute fight. And he realizes that Gracie is in trouble and he starts low-kicking more. Gracie runs in on him. Sakuraba slings him past and Gracie falls to the mat as Sakuraba's holding his sleeve and pounding in uppercuts. Sakuraba stands in the guard with his hands on his hips in that familiar position. And just as the time is running down on the round, 90 minutes deep into the fight, he leaps over Gracie's guard, and the commentators say, what on earth was he trying to do there? Did it not work? And then they show the replay between the rounds, and he dives over Gracie's legs and punches him in the face. And he actually lands, and it was just awesome to see him do it that late in the round. That late in the fight. And the thing that's so fascinating about this fight is that we've got Mo Smith and Bas Rutten, two brilliant kickboxers, watching this fight, and they're not bothered by the poor quality of the striking. They're just amazed at going this deep into a fight. 90 minutes is unheard of. And, Mo Smith is a guy who knows about conditioning. He was the one who proved that Coleman's weakness was the training for a longer fight. A 90-minute fight is almost unthinkable, and I don't think it's been beaten since. This fight makes for amazing watching, and it almost plays out as a better movie or screenplay than it does as an athletic contest. Just these tiny things making a huge difference. Nearing the end of the fight, I think it's in the 6th round, the camera cuts to a pair of hands ringing, in nervousness, and then it pans up and it's Elio Gracie. And the crowd saw this on the screen and they went absolutely mental. And then later in the round, they show the Gracies leaning on the ring apron and Horian's holding the towel in his hand. And the jubilation from the Japanese crowd at that sight is just... It'd be hard to find a better crowd reaction at like a WWE return, like someone coming out who you don't expect. And Sakuraba's genius in this fight... Well, actually, Sakuraba's genius generally... what you found when we moved from individual sports to MMA is that skill in individual combat sport doesn't dictate how well someone will do in MMA. The guys who do well in MMA are sometimes a surprise. It can be the guy who's not the best at the gym. It can be the guy who's like just the training partner to Kanehara and Anjo, or Takada. He was Takada's training partner for a long time, Sakuraba. Even though Pride would love to push Takada far more than they'd love to push Sakuraba, it is always surprising the guys who actually break out and prove themselves to be the best. And Sakuraba treated this fight like it was going to go 90 minutes. He played the long game. He kicked the legs. He took Royce's gas tank and his wheels away. And he did it allegedly while smoking a ridiculous amount of cigarettes every day. So not exactly the perfect athlete, but certainly a very clever fighter. And this is really what you're seeing with Royce Gracie. People know how to grapple now at this point in time. And it is becoming more of a sporting contest. And this is one of the key fights that makes the differentiation between, not just being knowledge anymore. It is about sport and preparing for a full contest. The strength of your technical ability or your understanding of something that no one else understands is not going to save you in a 90-minute fight against someone who knows what they're doing. So Sakuraba picks up the victory by retirement, and it was assumed all the way through that whoever won the fight wouldn't be going on to the rest of the tournament. It was kind of a sore point because it meant that there would be a dropout and a replacement in this tournament. And something interesting to remember is that Rickson Gracie was fighting at this time. Rickson was preparing for the fight against Masakazu Funaki, the Pancrase veteran. And Funaki was annoyed because at the time of this fight, Rickson had just put out a load of new demands about not allowing elbows and knees. And if you know much about Rickson Gracie, you'll know that he is revered for his technical ability. Anyone who trains with him says that, or trained with him while he was still, before his back was ruined, says he was amazing. But he didn't really fight anyone good. He fought Masakazu Funaki, who is easily the best fighter he ever fought, and then a lot of it is just part-timers or guys who don't know what they're doing. Rei Zulu was a giant guy but didn't really know anything about fighting. Jiu-jitsu rather, or grappling. Yuki Nakai knew a lot about grappling but was far smaller than Rickson. You never got to see Rickson in with the best guys who were around at the same time. You never got to see him in with a Coleman or even a Sakuraba. They talked about the Sakuraba fight for a long time after this, but Rickson decided he was retired. The other surprise for the Japanese fans during this event was the rise of Kazuyuki Fujita. And it wasn't a particularly long rise because Fujita's career was all downhill after his fourth fight. But his first fight was at the opening round of this Grand Prix. He took 2 fights between then, and then this fourth fight was against Mark Kerr, who was 2-time UFC champion and just about the scariest man in the competition. And he took Fujita down, roughed him up a little bit, and then gassed. And Fujita just poured it on. Fujita took some ferocious knees and stuff to the head. This is where the old Iron Head thing started. Fujita could take a shot like a madman. But his pace in this fight and the fact that he kept coming up, and he comes up on Kerr, and Kerr goes to the turtle. Kerr's breathing hard, so Fujita just jumps up and starts kneeing him in the belly. Had knees on the head been allowed against a turtled opponent, Fujita probably could have stopped him the same way that Vovchanchin did. But instead, Fujita just laid it on Mark Kerr for the latter half of the fight. It was a remarkable performance from a guy who had no reason to really put forward a performance like that. Mark Coleman's quarterfinal fight was a little bit easier. He met Akira Shoji, and he won a decision, not without some controversy, because the first take, he came out looking to box. He'd been training with Miletic. He looked wooden as anything, obviously, because he was a 30-year-old wrestler learning how to box. But he hit a knee on Shoji and then knee tapped him to the floor, and Shoji clutched his groin and said that he'd been hit low, and the referee broke them. And Coleman stood up screaming, that's fucking bullshit, blah, blah, blah. And the most ridiculous thing is that the referee did restart them from the feet when they resumed action. They didn't put... it was a clean, half-guard position. They could have just put him back on the bottom, but they didn't. So Coleman takes the decision over Shoji, who, as we said earlier, just masterful at dragging people to decisions who he probably shouldn't be able to. And not really getting hurt that badly in the process. And the final quarterfinal match, or the last quarterfinal match, was Igor Vovchanchin versus Gary Goodrich. They'd met once before, and Igor had won. But Gary Goodrich in himself is one of the saddest stories in combat sports. He is a perfect example of predatory matchmaking. He was a fun fighter. He hit really hard, but he didn't really know how to fight that well. He didn't have a proven record against good guys. And K1 especially took advantage of this. They kept matching him against world champion kickboxers. He had no business fighting Jerome Labana. He had even less business fighting Jerome Labana a second time after Labana had already knocked him out. Had no business fighting Glaub Feitosa or Cyril Abidi or Mike Bernardo. But they kept putting him in with these guys and letting him get knocked out in exciting fashion because he was one of those knockout or be knocked out fighters. But more often than not, he came up on the worse end of a beating. You could ask how arm wrestling translates as a style into mixed martial arts, but I think Gary Goodridge actually found a way in his early Pride run. Obviously, he had monstrous grip strength, huge forearms, hit really hard. But the grip strength thing really came in handy when he was in closed guard. Obviously, we are getting into the days where closed guard, ground and pound, not really cutting it anymore. It leads to some boring decisions. The guard play and the stand-ups haven't caught up yet, but it's not really knocking people out. But against one of Bas Rutten's students in the early Pride fights, Amir Ranavadi, he traps Ranavadi's hand behind his back, underneath him, in what's called the one-armed man pass, except he just drops right hands on him instead. Because he has this amazing grip strength. If you're holding the glove, it's going to be very hard for them to get their arm back. And he drops these right hands and just starches Ranavari. He also knocked out Oleg Tektarov at the very first Pride, got submitted by Marco Hues with a heel hook at Pride 2, knocked out Amir at Pride 3, suffered a knockout at the hands of Vovchanchin in their first fight at Pride 4. Had a few more fights between the UFC and Pride before this, and then he submitted Osamu Kawahara with that awful forearm choke in the opening round. But he came in against Vovchanchin, and his team had actually done a good job of preparing him. Vovchanchin, every time he hit, he would duck out the side door. He'd duck and then step out the side. And often when he threw his right hand, because everyone he fought was taller than him and he was trying to swing over the top, he would often lean down to the side as he threw this right hand over the top so that his shoulder was basically at 12 o'clock. And Goodridge's team noticed this, and they had Gary try and hit him with a knee after every punch. So Goodridge came in with his hands high a lot of the time, and the right hand or left hand would slap off his guard like a wet rag, and he'd grab a hold of Vovchanchin's head as he ducked and try and knee him. And it really worked well. He bloodied him up early. Then when they hit the mat, he was in Vovchanchin's guard. He trapped the hand under the back again, and it looked like it was going to be more of the same from the Ranavari fight. What saved Vovchanchin was his ability to roll with punches, get down behind the shoulder, and slip. He didn't improve his position at all. It was mainly, Gary did eventually lose the grip, but there wasn't like a quick answer to that grip. It was Vovchanchin surviving in the position as Goodridge tried to unload on him. Vovchanchin finally lands an overhand that sends Goodridge stumbling, and he slips and falls to the mat, and Vovchanchin finishes with punches. So this sets up Sakuraba versus Vovchanchin in the semi-finals, and Coleman is to fight Fujita. Coleman's fight is a lot shorter than expected, as Fujita comes out with a heavily taped up knee, shoots in on the first takedown, and his cornerman throws the towel in immediately behind him. It's a very strange finish to a fight. Clearly Fujita wanted to continue, but his corner didn't trust him to, but why you would wait until they're in the ring to do that is bizarre. So Coleman goes into the final fairly fresh. Igor Vovchanchin and Sakuraba, meanwhile, is a fight that no one ever thought would be happening because it was assumed that Sakuraba would pull out at the end of the what turned out to be a 90-minute fight. However, I would consider this one of Sakuraba's greatest performances because he comes straight from the 90-minute fight with Royce Gracie. Vovchanchin is coming in relatively fresh after knocking out Goodridge. And for the first part of the 15-minute round, Sakuraba takes Igor down, stands over him, drops punches on the midsection. In fact, Sakuraba's low single is gorgeous in this fight. At one point, Igor's chasing him to the corner. Igor steps in with the right hand, squares up. Sakuraba shoots on his left leg, spins around behind it as he picks it up from the corner to the center of the ring. Beautiful stuff. Unfortunately, the fatigue does start to get to Sakuraba, and Igor comes up on his back. Sakuraba's looking for his usual Kimura, but Igor suplexes him. Igor ends up on top, dropping in punches from the turtle and various other positions. And at the end of the fight, you would say that Igor was starting to pull ahead. So the 15-minute period ends, and they come to the center of the ring for the decision, and it's ruled a draw. So there's going to be an extension round. And at that point, Sakuraba says, okay, I'm going to retire now because I can't continue doing this. But it's simply amazing that he went 90 minutes with Royce Gracie, and then he came in against the number one heavyweight in the world at the time, many thought, went to a draw and could have won it if he'd kept going into the next round. Probably wouldn't have because he was absolutely destroyed, but cardio-wise, but pretty incredible nonetheless. The co-main event was that weird fight between Ken Shamrock and Alexander Otsuka. Really just cements that Ken Shamrock was very scary for a brief period of time, but once the sport moved on, he really wasn't that special anymore. He was a big, strong guy. Once he learned submissions, he was frightening at those. He was aggressive, but once he learned to box, or started trying to learn to box, he wasn't, he wasn't using the power that he had because he was holding back trying to box. And that meant guys could find his chin and show us that he didn't have the strongest chin. And anyway, he knocks out Otsuka, which isn't particularly interesting. But then the final of the tournament is Igor Vovchanchyn versus Mark Coleman. You got the guy that many thought to be number one in the world against an old veteran in Coleman, who most people thought was slipping, with that obvious weakness in his cardio. And the first part of this fight is very tedious. It's the closed guard, trying to work, not really getting much done. Igor Vovchanchyn on the bottom, holding and throwing that slappy knuckle punch over the back of the head. Then at the start of the second round, Coleman gets him down, and there's a scramble, and Coleman eventually passes the guard. Vovchanchyn ends up in a weird position, bottom of north-south, with his feet on the ropes in the corner. So he's really stuck to in terms of where he can move. And Coleman begins dropping knees on his head. And this is one of the reasons I love knees to the head on the ground, because the north-south goes from a useless holding position to one of the most dangerous positions in the fight. He begins dropping these knees. At first they're coming in from above the top of Vovchanchyn's head, like they're coming in from along the mat. And then his corners say, no, straight down. And he starts really tripoding up and dropping them straight down through, which makes it a lot harder for Vovchanchyn to just stick his hands out and stop them on his palms. And Vovchanchyn eventually taps to these knees, which are pretty brutal, and a sort of indication of what's to come with Kevin Randleman's skyscraper knees. And those Overeem and Shogun also used great knees from side control and north-south. And Coleman just goes wild when he wins because the storyline was that he was done, and he does a great speech about him being old, maybe losing his hair, but he ain't that fucking old. And thank you to everyone who helped him and all that, because he was training with Mark Kerr, thinking that Kerr was the future, and it turns out that Coleman is the guy who wins the tournament, and Kerr goes out rather unimpressively. But the final of the tournament isn't really the most important thing. Like, that's fairly underwhelming next to some of the stuff that happened during it. The Sakuraba run through the tournament was incredible. The Royce Gracie Sakuraba match was incredible. Fujita's comeback against Kerr was incredible. Vovchanchyn's knockout of Goodridge was pretty impressive. One of the reasons that Vovchanchyn was so remarkable was, well, I reeled off those that list of tournaments, the 3 tournaments that he took part in March of 1996 or whenever it was. He fought 9-10 guys in 1 month, on like 3 nights, and none of them made it the distance with him. It was very rare to stop people at that rate, and it was even rarer to stop them with knockouts. So that's why Igor Vovchanchyn was such a huge deal. Even though his wrestling wasn't the greatest, and when he met a really great wrestler in Coleman, he seemed pretty helpless. But in terms of putting Pride on the map, this event did wonders for them. I mean, the Ken Shamrock thing did interest a lot of pro wrestling fans and a lot of people who enjoyed his run in the UFC. Pride grew enormously after this event. As I said, they did 6 events in 2000, and then they just kept getting more and more year by year, eventually introducing the Bushido brand and having 2 different brands of event. They became a fixture on New Year's Eve along with K1, and Sakuraba was allowed to fight way longer than he should. They kept putting him in against killers when he was just not the man anymore. But Wanderlei Silva came to the forefront. He was an alternate fight in this tournament, and things changed very quickly at the top of MMA. Guys can hang around forever being like, not picking up too many losses. They'll pick up 2 wins and then a loss, or 3 wins and then a loss. But at the very top level, things do change fairly rapidly. Pride was able to acquire a lot of the old guys from the UFC. This was an era where the UFC wasn't really paying that much, and Pride could offer more money, not huge amounts of money compared to what we're talking about today. The prize for this tournament was $200,000, which would be an incredible amount for a fighter back then. Mark Coleman got into MMA because he was broke, and then after being one of the best in the world at MMA, he was still broke. So this tournament was like a life changer for him. But the Grand Prix became a grand tradition. Obviously, Fedor came to dominate them in later years. Mirko Krokop won I believe it was the final one, was that 2006? Then the lightweight Grand Prix was obviously a huge thing, and they had a middleweight Grand Prix. The Grand Prix were just the most spectacular events Pride put on, and one of the things that made them especially wonderful was the unpredictable nature. Someone's going to get injured or drop out. There will be guys pulling off upsets. You're almost guaranteed an upset on a 8 or 16 person tournament. And that was something that Pride could do that the UFC could not. And in many ways, that helped them in terms of making them a more exciting product. But in other ways, it didn't help them, when big name fighters are losing in fights that they probably wouldn't if they'd taken months especially just to train for that one opponent that isn't really on their level. But if you do it in a tournament format where they've got to train for the possibility of anyone, suddenly they're losing to people that maybe they shouldn't. Because there's a huge difference between a tournament fighter and a regular great fighter. Mo Smith said this during the commentary on one of the fights in this 2000 Grand Prix. He said that he wouldn't enter a Grand Prix. I believe he did later enter a K1 Grand Prix, but he was saying that he didn't like one-night tournaments. It's just too much to ask of a fighter. And he said that he believed if a fighter was already established, they shouldn't have to do that. Obviously, Igor made his reputation by going through one-night tournaments, just a host of them. And really, that's what they moved towards with the UFC. Guys would fight in the tournament, and then if they did really well, a couple of times, then they'd be thrown into the super fight rather than having to fight 3 guys in one night, or later 2 guys in one night. But let's talk about our main characters and what they went on to do. I've talked about Gary Goodridge. His decline was very, very sad. He suffered severe CTE, and he has a lot of health difficulties as a result of what the Japanese did to him. Well, no, not just the Japanese, but mainly the Japanese promoters did to him. He's not going to turn down money to keep fighting. This is the problem with all fighters. We want to pay our favorites to stick around, but we don't want them to stick around and get tons of brain damage. And if they can't hang with the best anymore, we can't just keep them around and try and find them easier and easier fights if they're still losing them. But Goodridge is a particularly annoying example because they didn't at any point step down the competition. They just kept giving him good kickboxes and getting him knocked out. Igor Vovchanchin went on to be like a Pride mainstay. He picked up a few good knockouts. The Ensign Inoue fight is legendary. Ensign Inoue came out ready to swing with Vovchanchin, and it really brought out the dog in Vovchanchin. Inoue was peeled off the mat between rounds and couldn't come out for the second. And he famously said afterwards, "Every time I fuck up, I blame it on Igor Vovchanchin." Very brave fighter, but not a very good game plan for that fight. He did fight Mark Kerr again in a fairly uneventful fight where he took the decision. He suffered a surprising loss to Trey Telligman and Mario Sperry, Heath Herring, and Quentin Jackson. Really, that was one of the big early fights of Quentin Jackson's career, being able to beat Vovchanchin. Submission by injury because he just kept slamming him, which was really impressive because Vovchanchin was a heavy guy by that time. Vovchanchin later in his career, he went down to 205 pounds, and he actually looked very svelte, once he started cutting down weight. And he looked really good there. He knocked out Yoshiki Takahashi with an amazing clothesline punch, right hook, almost straight arm, knuckles pointing in. Incredible. Almost like a back fist or a furi uchi, like a whip strike in Goju-ryu. But then he lost. He boxed up Yuki Kondo as well. But he lost a fight to Alistair Overeem by standing guillotine, and then he finally lost a decision to Kazuhiro Nakamura in the 2005 middleweight Grand Prix reserve bout. So that's a bit of a fall, going from like mainstay in the 2000 tournament to the reserve on a 2005 tournament. But then the 2005 middleweight tournament was stacked with talent. Middleweight was a very strong division for Pride, because that's light heavyweight as we know it today. But Vovchanchin, he was an interesting story because when he cut down weight again, he looked a lot faster. He didn't have to deal with as strong wrestlers. The strength makes a big difference, especially if you're not someone with all that pedigree in wrestling. If you're fighting someone about your own size and you're just working on counter wrestling and they're about your strength, you're a lot better off than if you're fighting 240-pound Mark Coleman when you're like a 205 with a ton of extra fat on it. But he also looked much quicker. He had this lovely left step up front kick that he used to throw in combination. Didn't really throw it that much at heavyweight, but once he went down to 205, his kicks looked great. In fact, as he was slimming down towards 205, there were a couple of really good fights. I think it was Katsuhisa Fuji was the one where he really just boxed this dude up. And kickboxed him up, actually. Used his kicks lovely. He had a kickboxing match against Ernesto Hoost, and Ernesto Hoost just basically showed him up for not being the caliber of kickboxer that Hoost was. Hoost could... it was TKO via low kicks, so, that's just showing that he'd mastered the distance much better than Vovchanchin. And also that Vovchanchin did rely on his hands a little bit too much for a guy who was a kickboxer. But one of the most important early knockout artists in MMA. Knockout artists really weren't a thing in MMA at the time. It was trying to deal with the wrestling. Even guys like Bas Rutten very rarely knocked guys out outright. Even the TK one, that came after like a 30-minute fight. But Vovchanchin was a guy who could start a guy at any point in the fight. It could be the first punch, it could be 25 minutes in. And that makes people want to watch. Mark Coleman, his return to like prominence was quite brief. He fought Alan Goes in his next fight, and that was a gorgeous one where, like a minute in, he gets a front headlock and just starts kneeing. And that's really where you see the difference that knees make. He just starches Goes face down on the floor. Then he fights Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira, and this is sort of the coming of the new generation. Nogueira comes over from rings, triangles him. He fights Don Fry again, gets the decision in Pride, and then he's up against Fedor, gets armbarred. Krokop gets knocked out. The thing about Mark Coleman is that you remember him for being around for ages, but from 2000, from that Vovchanchin win in 2000 to 2010 when he lost to Randy Couture and retired, he only got in 11 fights, so like just a little bit over one a year, and a lot of really disappointing losses in that time. Really, by the Pride 2000 Grand Prix, guys were asking if he was too old. By the time he was fighting Fedor the second time, it was just starting to look bad. Though it was fun watching him turn it back and wrestle Stephan Bonner to a decision. The much younger Stephan Bonner at UFC 200. He's had I think it was a double hip replacement now. He had a hip replacement and sought crowdfunding help for that, I believe. He seems in good shape now. I mean, he's had some rough times, but even like into his 40s, there are great photos of him training with John Jones. I believe at Jackson Wink, but him hitting doubles on John Jones. He could do one thing really, really well. Actually, if you watch his fight with Don Fry, he shoots the double. Don Fry knows the double's coming because everyone knows the double's coming. He snaps on the front headlock and sprawls as hard as he can, and Coleman just comes up and sucker drags him like it's nothing. He just whips his head out and arm drags the guy straight onto his back. Effortless. The guy he has Hulk strength and is really good within like the limited wrestling techniques. The funniest thing about the entire Pride run of Coleman and Kerr and a few others, actually, Kevin Randleman, Phil Baroni, is that they claim to be under the Hammer House banner. But apparently they didn't have a gym. Like Phil Baroni said that the Hammer House gym was quite literally a heavy bag on Mark Coleman's porch. They were just like four guys who claimed to be a gym so that Pride could book them as a gym and they could have rivalries with people. And they'd corner each other and they'd work out together. But a lot of the time they weren't even working together, apparently. But this is all from Phil Baroni, so could all be a bit of an exaggeration. But they weren't like a modern team; they weren't a camp. Mark Kerr's decline was a lot harder. After the Fujita fight, he was 12-1. He ended up at 15-11. So in the course of the next 9 years or so, he picked up 3 more wins and double-digit losses basically. It was very sad in 2009 when they were trying to build up King Mo. M1 put Mark Kerr in against him, and Mark Kerr just looked like he was basically just a fat old man. Got knocked out in 25 seconds. It was really sad. However, Mark Kerr did do exceptionally well in ADCC. His only loss was a points loss to Ricardo Arona. He submitted Josh Barnett with a Kimura. He didn't submit a lot of people. He just sort of took him down. But finally, Kazushi Sakuraba aged very hard. It was a graceless decline on Sakuraba's part. After beating Henzo Gracie and Heian Gracie in really good fights, he became the Gracie Hunter. He suffered his first real TKO against Vanderlei Silva, which really was starting to show that he wasn't going to be able to hang at middleweight against real middleweights, light heavyweights. It was called middleweight in Pride. He fights a very green Quinton Jackson, gets a rear naked because all Quinton Jackson's concerned with is trying to slam him. He suffers losses to Vanderlei Silva again. Once they brought back knees on the ground to a turtled opponent, he wasn't going to have any luck against Vanderlei. Fought Mirko Krokop, which was a ludicrous fight. In his own autobiography, he says, "How did I get into this?" It's just, why would they sign that? And he did decently, but it's just at a certain point, it's not worth seeing how good a fighter can do going up that much weight. It's just harmful to their career. Everything that happens, like if you get wizarded by a guy who's 40, 50 pounds heavier than you, doesn't matter if your technique's perfect, it's going to fuck you up, It's going to fuck up your shoulder. And so on. Armbar's Gilles Arsene, which was just a guy who had no idea what he was doing. Sakuraba just wailed on him. Surprise knockout loss to Nino Schembri, Elvis, legendary omoplata user. Another knockout loss to Vanderlei Silva, but he'd been working on his striking after the previous ones, and that looked all right. But then he fought Kevin Randleman in one of his best performances. Randleman just tries to ragdoll him. Sakuraba keeps getting up to his knees, keeps working for that Kimura, finally stands up, puts in that hook, throws him with the Sumigayashi. Kevin Randleman rolls up, and Sakuraba goes over for the armbar. And nowadays, if you see guys using the Kimura, a lot of them will be using it to either from the top to roll over and have the opponent come up to their knees and throw in the far hook for the back control, or from the bottom to turn the guy over and again have him come up and get the hook in for the back control. If you watch Wagner Rocha, David Avalan, another grappler from ADCC who does that a lot, Gordon Ryan uses the Kimura all the time to take the back. Andre Galvao does it a lot from the top. The Kimura itself has become a handle to get to the armbar in the back. It's not really a submission finish anymore, because Sakuraba, I believe, finished like 2 guys, maybe a few more, I can't remember, but he finished Minoa Man and Funaki with the Kimura, but most of his wins were armbars. He got an awful lot of armbars. The really sad one was his loss to Ricardo Arona in 2005, where he just got kneed into oblivion, couldn't take Arona down, because obviously Kerr struggled to take Arona down, but Arona just smashed him with knees, and that's a pretty nasty fight, because Sakuraba's face is split open, and Arona's putting his thumb in the cut. It really gets sad when he has a rematch with Royce Gracie, and allegedly Royce Gracie got like hundreds of thousands of dollars to turn up, and Sakuraba got like $80,000 to turn up, and Gracie tested positive for anabolic steroids, and won a judge's decision by basically scooting along the ground and trying to kick at Sakuraba's legs. It was pretty much a disgraceful fight. Actually, one of the interesting fights on Sakuraba's record was against Katsuyori Shibata, who's become a very famous pro wrestler. I believe Shibata went and trained with Sakuraba for MMA after that fight. But Shibata is one of the top guys, or was one of the top guys in New Japan. Recently suffered really bad brain injury due to really stiff headbutts that he does, combined with dehydration from being in like a 40-minute match. Continued getting sadder when he was getting knocked out by guys like Melvin Manhoof, Had a fight with Halleck Gracie at the age of 40-something. Almost caught him exactly the same way with the Kimura. Every time he turned his back, Gracie would grab a hold of the body lock and Sakuraba would start breaking the hands apart and work with the Kimura. Gracie's shorts got in the way and they caused like a break in the action, and it seemed like Halleck got away with it when Sakuraba could have maybe got him. But, you don't want to do too much of that, maybe this, maybe that stuff. But it was a very hollow moral victory for the Gracies, but that's the kind that they seem to pick up when they've lost. They then get a rematch and don't really decisively sort it. But yeah, Jason Miller, Marius Zaromskis, Jan Cabral, Shinya Aoki, these are the guys that Sakuraba finished his career against, and there was just no point. The Shinya Aoki one, really depressing, because people treated it like it was going to be a great grappling match. But no, why would Shinya Aoki just not punch the guy? So Shinya Aoki gets on top of him and just pounds him relentlessly for 5 minutes until the corner stops it. One of the interesting parts of Sakuraba's career was his rivalry with Kiyoshi Tamura. They worked together in Kingdom, have some really interesting... the match that I've seen them in was really beautiful, like flowing back and forth, lots of Kimuras and rolling and stuff, exactly like Sakuraba actually fights. Both students of Billy Robinson. Between them, they handed the Gracies the first 2 losses on their collective record in MMA. But Tamura really isn't remembered as well because he suffered some weird losses, like to Bob Sapp and things like that. But he did fight guys like Frank Shamrock and Pat Miletich, and he beat Henzo. I think he fought Dan Henderson. Tamura was consistently underrated as a fighter, and sort of like an afterthought, where Sakuraba became the superstar of Japan. Tamura was just sort of like another guy on the card. Tamura was also really good at timing kicks and knees to the body as his opponent stepped in. That's how he mauled Minoa Man. Did it to Pat Miletich too. Didn't like knock him out or anything, but it was pretty cool that he could do that on a guy at that level. And they eventually did have a match, and Tamura won the decision. It wasn't a particularly interesting match, but it was just interesting how things went full circle, because Tamura, he could be bitter about the fact that his accomplishments up until the Sakuraba Royce Gracie fight were pretty similar to Sakuraba's, and he sort of got left behind while Sakuraba became the superstar. But that's a story for another day. I think catch wrestling generally, and Billy Robinson himself, stories for another day. Sakuraba's effects on the fight game have been remarkable. The way that he made Pride, he was Pride's Japanese star, and Pride became like a television fixture. It was on one of the main channels on New Year's Eve every year, and got incredible viewership. In fact, Lorenzo Fertitta went to one of the Pride events before he bought the UFC. He was a big fan of the events, and allegedly it was the plan to continue Pride in some form after they bought it, but they just couldn't work it out. The happy ending to this story, I suppose, is that earlier this month it was announced that Sakuraba would be inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame. He did only have 2 fights in the UFC, one of them a no contest and one of them that armbar victory over Marcus Silveira. But, if you consider that the UFC did buy Pride and they own the back catalogue and stuff, in terms of Zuffa-owned stars or just stars of the modern MMA era, if there were a MMA Hall of Fame and Sakuraba wasn't in it, that would be a travesty. So the fact that they're letting Sakuraba into the UFC Hall of Fame, even though he only had a couple of fights there, really warms my heart. And that was the decision that made us do this episode. So I hope you all enjoyed it, and might return to business as normal with the heavyweight title history. Might try and do some more MMA history. I mean, the Pride Lightweight Grand Prix, the one that Gomi ran through, was one of my all-time favourite tournaments. I just love tournaments generally, to be honest. In terms of storyline, no event is going to give you as much to talk about and think about, and as much backstage stuff and as much injuries and speculation as a tournament. They're just chaotic, and that's fighting at its best. It's thriving amid chaos. Anyway, I've been your boy, Jacuzzi Slackaraba. Thank you for supporting us at the Fights Gone By podcast, and I hope to continue bringing you these history lectures, I suppose. Saku bless.